Well, I have to confess that every once in a while you certainly learn something new, and that's thanks to my viewers as well as just general research that I tend to do in my spare time. Well, I'll call it just perusing for fun about various vehicles. So I thought it was interesting when I saw that Derek over at Vice Grip Garage posted a video about him trying to get a 1967 Jeep Wagoneer going, and this particular Wagoneer was equipped with the Dauntless 350 cubic inch V8 or the Buick V8. Now, that particular Wagoneer was a 1967, as I mentioned, and I didn't know that those Dauntless V8s came in Wagoneers in 1967. And in fact, Derek mentions that at the front of the video. So I knew that those were in Wagoneers from 1968 through about 1971, but it appears some 1967s late in the model year may have squeaked through with the so-called Dauntless V8, which amazingly was a Buick V8. Yes, a Buick V8 in a Jeep. And I thought, well, maybe some of my viewers want to learn a little bit more about Buick engines in Jeeps, and in particular, the Buick 350 cubic inch V8. So let's talk a little bit more about that today and take a look at this particular 1969 Jeep Gladiator that is equipped, indeed, with the Dauntless V8, the 350 cubic incher. Now, many of you classic car lovers will know that Jeep was owned for years by American Motors Corporation, and that was one of the reasons why Chrysler ended up buying American Motors in the late 1980s, was to get control of the Jeep brand. That really was the crown jewels of the entire company. But what some may not know is that before 1970, Jeep was not in American Motors' hands. American Motors bought them in 1970, but before that, they were owned by Kaiser, and previous to that, it was Willis. In any case, Kaiser owned them during this time frame in the late 1960s. They had not yet transferred over to AMC ownership, and so there wasn't really a natural V8, let's say, that Kaiser was producing that could go under hood in these Jeeps. So that was part of the reason for needing a V8, was that Kaiser just didn't have any of its own to put under hood. And, well, there was also a relationship that had started with Buick by this point. In fact, the seeds of the relationship between Jeep and Buick probably were germinated all the way back in 1962, for it was in that particular year that Buick was looking for a way to lower the entry price point of its senior compact, the Special. And in 1961, when the car was introduced, along with the Oldsmobile F85, by the way, there was also the Pontiac Tempest, and the Chevrolet Corvair came out the year before that. But in 1962, Buick wanted to lower the price, and it was really tough because in 1961, the standard engine in the Special, which was the same as the standard engine in the Olds F85, although Oldsmobile did make some modifications to the engine, was an all-new 215 cubic inch aluminum block V8. Now, the aluminum block V8 was a decent little engine on its own, but it was certainly expensive to manufacture, particularly given the aluminum block. I mean, this isn't like today where aluminum is employed for pretty much every engine block these days. It was a relatively novel technology back then, and again, it was expensive to produce. So in 1962, Buick decided, well, heck, we're going to introduce a cast iron variant of that V8, lop a couple cylinders off, change it to cast iron, and create the Buick Fireball V6 for 1962. And while it initially was 198 cubic inches, it would later be expanded to 225 cubic inches, and eventually it would become the famous Buick 3800 V6. But the 3800 was first introduced in 1988, and that 3800 was a so-called even-firing engine with balance shafts. This early V6 with its 90-degree bank angle and odd firing design was, let's say, a little bit of a shaker in its early years. Now, interestingly, along the way, as muscle cars became increasingly popular and demand for gasoline-powered V8 engines in particular soared, while Buick had developed this engine in 1962 and has started supplying Kaiser Jeep with these engines as the Dauntless 225 V6 in 1965, Buick ended up selling this engine to Kaiser in 1967. So the famous Buick 3800 was actually a Buick engine, then became a Kaiser engine, then became an AMC engine. And here's where it gets a little interesting. That Buick V6 became, as I said, an AMC engine when AMC bought Kaiser in 1970. Now, AMC had 6 cylinders of its own, its inline 6-cylinder engines, which were excellent engines and frankly much, much smoother and inherently smoother than the Buick V6. So AMC decided to start employing its own 6-cylinder engines in its Jeeps as opposed to using the V6 engine that Kaiser bought. Then a few years later, General Motors determined that, well, maybe they actually want the tooling for their V6 engine back as fuel economy became of utmost importance after the 1973 OPEC oil embargo. So GM actually bought the engine back in 1974 from AMC, and, well, the rest is history. It ended up becoming a very, very popular and well-known engine for General Motors. But that was how the relationship with Buick started with Kaiser Jeep back then. They started procuring the 225 cubic inch V6s. By the way, a V6 was a pretty novel configuration back at this time for an engine. There were quite a few inline 6-cylinder engines. GMC did have its own V6 engine, or I should say line of V6 engines, and even an awesome kind of twin-six V12. It was more than just a twin-six, but at least it looked like one with its valve cover designs. And so it was pretty novel by the standards of the day, except it was a little shaky. Now, when Jeep needed some more V8 power in the latter portion of the 1960s, they'd been previously using AMC's 327 cubic inch V8s under hood, but they allegedly wanted something that was a little bit larger for use under hood in these Jeeps. And so they decided to start buying Buick V8s, the 350 cubic inch V8s. Sometime it appears late in 1967, certainly by the 1968 model year, and continued buying them all the way through 1971. Of course, by that point, Jeep, as I mentioned, was part of American Motors, and American Motors had its own V8s that it wanted to put under hood in Jeeps, like the AMC 360, which would be in Jeeps for a long time, particularly in the Wagoneers and Grand Wagoneers, pretty much the ubiquitous powertrain for the latter Grand Wagoneers. Now, one funny fact is that while the Buick 350 was slightly bigger than the AMC 327 cubic inch V8 that Jeep had been using prior to buying these Buick V8s, it actually made a little bit less horsepower. It made 230 horsepower through a Rochester 2GC carburetor. The AMC was making 250 horsepower. So you got a little less power. My guess is that there was some kind of dispute perhaps between Kaiser and AMC over the pricing of the engine. Maybe Jeep didn't want to pay the amount. They got a better relationship or better deal with Buick, and that really spurred on the purchase of these Buick 350 cubic inch V8s, which were generally good engines overall. Buick V8s do have some challenges, like the oil pumps sometimes wear out if the oil isn't changed frequently. They do have a water pump that goes through the front timing cover, and the water pump, as Derek finds out, is a beast to repair, often because the bolts break off, particularly the ones that go through the water jackets. So in fact, in the video that he does, he elects not to repair the water pump, and despite the fact that the bearing is loose, limp it home by taking the fan off to reduce the kind of, let's say, forces on the water pump and running the belt pretty loose, which ends up working out for him amazingly, and the water pump holds. So watch the video in his Vice Grip Garage channel if you get a chance. It's a pretty fun one. I really did enjoy it. But in any case, as I mentioned, by the early 1970s, Jeep had transferred its ownership, or was purchased by American Motors, I should say. And after that, well, there was no need for the Buick V8s any longer. Now, the interesting thing was that while Jeep was really the crown jewels of American Motors, and probably the sole reason behind why Chrysler wanted it in the 1980s, the acquisition of Jeep in 1970 actually put AMC really on the precipice financially, because the company had to take on so much debt at relatively high interest rates in 1970 that it had to spend quite a bit of its own money financing the interest expense on the debt. And that really took away from other, let's say, uses of cash, like research and development expenditures or capital expenditures that had to go to interest expense associated with buying Jeep. And you have to remember, back when AMC bought Jeep, it also wasn't that kind of a it was a popular brand, but it wasn't all that successful at the time, particularly after the OPEC oil embargo. Well, nobody really wanted a big, heavy, gas-guzzling SUV. That just wasn't something that people were looking for. And in fact, kind of all throughout the 1970s, Jeep did okay, but never really did all that great. It really wasn't until the introduction of the unibody Jeep Cherokee in 1984 that Jeep really took off, because that was lightweight, relatively fuel efficient. Unibody, as I mentioned, had the same 4x4 capabilities as any Jeep that preceded it. And that was also a four-door compact SUV with a footprint of kind of a modern-day Honda Civic or even less. It was a very small vehicle. But as a consequence, that was the vehicle that put Jeep on the map. But by 1984, well, AMC was already on the brink. It was just too late, and Renault had already taken a sizable stake. They couldn't make it on their own anymore, unfortunately. So that's a little bit of the history of Jeep and the so-called Dauntless 350 cubic inch Buick V8 that you would find under hood to complement some Buick V6s that you would find under hood in Jeeps, dating all the way back to around the 1965 model year and continuing on through 1971, when, just like the V8, AMC would replace these non-AMC engines from General Motors with their own offerings. So what do you think of the Buick V8s in Jeeps? Well, I have to say that I love Jeeps of this era in general. I think they're rugged, they're dependable, they're great looking. By the way, that front end that you see on this Gladiator pickup is effectively the same sheet metal as the Grand Wagoneer that lasted many decades after this. Jeep engineers and stylists were just artists when it came to redesigning a front end and an overall car using no money. I mean, it's hard to discern this Gladiator front end, and the hood even. If you look at it, you can see it is the exact same as the Grand Wagoneer. And looking behind all of the Grand Wagoneer's, let's say, grille and peripheral items, is the same sheet metal that is underpinning this Gladiator. So just amazing overall ingenuity. I'd love to potentially have a Dauntless Jeep one day. So we'll see what happens if it's in the cards. Unfortunately, I passed on a 15,000 mile mint condition. It wasn't a Grand Wagoneer. It was a Wagoneer maybe about 8 or 9 years ago, and I could have bought it for nothing. I think like 14,000, 15,000, which I thought was a lot of money at the time, and it was a lot of money at the time. I can only imagine what that Wagoneer would be worth today, but oh well, you can't buy them all. Thanks again for watching. Be sure to put a comment in the comment section, and Happy New Year to all.